Dan, for the first time in a while, I lost sleep last night.
Oh, no. Now what?
No, I lost sleep because I'm excited about what we're doing right now.
Not worried, huh? That's good. That's good.
Yeah, if only our listeners knew exactly what is in store for them for this episode.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah. So everyone out there, thank you for tuning in to the Woodhounds podcast. And today, Dan and I have a very special guest, and his name is Professor John Pastor. He is a professor emeritus of University of Minnesota, Duluth, and he is the author of a book that I had stumbled across and I read and just thoroughly enjoyed. And we asked him to come on for the podcast, and he graciously accepted. The name of the book is White Pine, The Natural and Human History of a Foundational American Tree. John, how are you doing?
Good. How are you guys?
Doing great.
Well, I'm a little this is that time of the year, and you know about this from the white pine. I'm a little annoyed with the white pine right now because my deck is yellow. Everything is yellow. So other than that, I'm doing great.
Well, I'm starting to sniffle because of the white pine pollen coming right from the tree outside this window right over here.
Oh, wow. I have 2 white pines in my front yard, and I always knew that they were white pines because I just did the research. And, so white pines, when you think of pine trees, there's like the spruce with those little jabby needles. And then the white pine has, what do you call them, John? Is it like a fan? They're like 5 little floppy fingers that come off of each leaf.
Yeah, they're 5 needles that are joined at the base by a little bundle of tissue that then attaches to the twig. And those 5 needles plus that bundle of tissue together, it's called the fascicle.
Oh, wow.
And that is typical of all of the other kinds of white pines, which is sort of a big branch of the pine genus, pine family. And things like western white pine and white bark pine are related to eastern white pine, which is what this book is about. And the characteristic of all of these white pines is that they have 5 needles joined at their base, and that's what attaches them to the twig.
All right. So, John, I don't want to offend you at the very beginning, but hear me out on this. And Dan and I are firewooders, and when we think of trees, we have a bias to the hardwoods.
Right.
And it was just the other day I was watching a YouTube video, and it was of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony, and they had this set with like Eric Clapton and Tom Petty and George Harrison's son, and that Jeff Lynne from ELO, and they were playing a Beatles tune. Well, what do you know? Prince, who lives up your way, well, he's deceased now. Yeah, he came out on stage and he just threw down one of the most epic guitar solos I have ever heard in my life. And I left that video thinking I felt just ignorant that I never realized that Prince was such an amazing guitarist.
Yeah.
And that was the same feeling that I came away from reading your book about the white pine. It never.
Nobody has ever compared me to Prince before. What an honor! What an honor!
Yeah, well, it could be the purple suit that you're wearing right now. I don't know, but no, I'm serious. When I think of Dan, serious. When you think of trees, if you named off 5 trees, would you name anything of a softwood?
Possibly only because of where I'm from and where I live right now. But yeah, generally for firewood, you think of, your oaks, your maple, your ash, your cherry. But like I said, I live in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and
Mhm.
this city was built because of the white pine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Well, with firewood, I've got 4 cords of oak, maple, and birch stacked outside, and about a half cord in our basement right now. So I agree. You don't want to burn any conifer for firewood. So,
Yeah.
uh, you know, oak, maple, and birch is what we burn up here.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking. When I think of trees, and it's not just a firewood bias. And guys, everyone out there listening, this is not going to be just about firewood here, because of this history lesson that awaits you and the role that the white pine played, and not only the motivation behind the rebellion and the revolution, and then just
Right.
the building this nation starts with white and continues to be with white pine. But when I think of trees, I think of oaks, the USS Constitution with the oak timbers, old Ironsides. I think of the elm tree, the Liberty tree. I think of the maple, and our neighbors to the north with the maple leaf on their flag. John, I was just amazed at the role that the white pine has played in the formation of our country. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's white pine is the kind of what we call in ecology the foundational species of the North Woods. And the North Woods is sort of that band of forest that's a mixture of pines and balsam fir and spruce and maples, some birches that run from Maine, maybe even Nova Scotia, all the way west into through New York, particularly in the Adirondacks, maybe coming down into northern Pennsylvania a little bit, and then up through Michigan, both the lower and upper peninsula, Wisconsin, where Dan is kind of the southern edge of the Northwoods. You go much south of you, Dan, and you're into more pure hardwoods.
Yep.
And then up into northeastern Minnesota. And this is about where it ends because the prairie is about 3 hours drive west of here. And then you get into western Minnesota and the Dakotas, and you're in ranch country out there. So when you think of the North Woods, you think of um, big pines and maples and balsam fir. So it's sort of the woods of where you could get maple syrup and Christmas trees and white pine lumber. That's kind of what
Yeah.
you think of.
Yep.
Hmm.
And and but white pine is the tree that kind of structures this whole ecosystem. That's what we mean by a foundational tree. It's the largest tree by far. When you look out, if you get on a hill and look out over the North Woods here outside of Duluth where I am, the white pines are towering over anything else. Anything else. But it's really nice to do this in the fall because then you see all the orange and red maples and stuff, and you see these green pines. But because they're so big, they control a lot of the energy input into the forest through photosynthesis, through its huge, enormous crowns. So they're pulling energy in, and then that energy, when the leaves fall off, the needles fall off after they're 2 or 3 years old, goes into the soil, and with its nutrients, and it's recycled. It becomes available to the other trees. The white pine provides habitat. Up here, if you want to find a bald eagle's nest, inevitably it's in a white pine tree because those nests weigh, because they're made of big sticks and stuff. Ospreys the same way. Those nests weigh 500 pounds or more.
Oh,
And
wow.
so you need these huge spreading branches that high up that the white pines provide for eagles and ospreys. Bears in the fall will tear open the cones for the seeds. Red squirrels will do the same. They're um, they're the host tree for a kind of butterfly called the pine elfin butterfly, and on and on and on. So every species in the North Woods somehow is connected in some way to white pine. That's why we think of it as the foundation of the North Woods.
Excellent. Excellent. And then Dan, you and I were talking about this before, and you had mentioned about your area. It was real big with sawmills and um
Right.
Yep.
yeah. What is your experience with that, Dan?
Yeah, and I never really thought of the white pine like you mentioned about the fundamental or the foundation of the forest. Like growing up here, you've always heard of the foundation of like what built the West, like what built the country was the white pine, and all the
Right.
white pine coming down through the Chippewa and Eau Claire rivers,
Right.
and then heading out. Like Eau Claire, I think at one time had I don't even know how many sawmills, and that's what
Oh yeah.
built the city was the sawmill business of sawing up white pines.
Yep. Yep. Weyerhaeuser actually started in the Chippewa Valley. That's where Frederick Weyerhaeuser, the patriarch, started. And then after they got through all the white pine, they said, okay, we're going out west because they've got Douglas fir out there. And
Yeah,
so
yep.
Weyerhaeuser became a Western company, but Weyerhaeuser, uh, the company got its start in the Chippewa Valley. And much of that lumber got sent down to St. Louis. So the lumber that built St. Louis, the city, came from your part of the
The
woods there.
Northwoods. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, the North Woods. So how many board feet do you think came out of the Chippewa Valley of white pine over the years?
Oh, no idea.
Let's see. I've got it written here. I wrote down some notes here. Um, 46 billion board feet
Ooh.
came out just out of the Chippewa and Eau Claire River valleys. How,
Wow.
just for comparison, Maine is often thought of, and it once was the real stronghold of white pine. That's where most of the white pine came during colonial times. Out of Maine, all of Maine, only about 5 to 7 billion board feet of white pine came out of Maine. So we're talking about 7 times as much white pine was harvested from the Chippewa River Valley and Eau Claire River valleys as was harvested in the entire state of Maine.
Wow.
And that's amazing.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's incredible. And then Stillwater, which is another used to be a big sawmill town, a little south of you on the St. Croix River in Minnesota. Stillwater milled about 7 billion board feet, just that one town, as
Ooh.
in the entire state of Maine. So Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota were the real. This was the cream of the cream for
Yeah.
Yep.
white pine out here.
Yeah. What is it about the white pine that made it more desirable above all the other softwoods?
Well, it's large. It's the largest of all of them.
Hmm.
You know, it during when the loggers were and lumberjacks were first coming through here, trees that were 4 foot in diameter and 140 feet tall were, not the most abundant size. Most trees were maybe 2 to 3 feet in diameter, but it was not uncommon to find trees that big. And you could still find trees that big
Yeah.
here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So just the size of it was huge. You could mill these big planks out of it and beams for barns and bridges. Much of the bridges that was done in New England were white pine, some oak timber, but white pine. It was light, so it would float, and that's why the you could have white pine sent to the mills by river drives. If you tried to do sugar maple or oak, which are much heavier, by a river drive, they they'd float, but they wouldn't float like a white pine. They'd get
It'd be
hung
tough.
up and
Yep.
everything else. It'd be tough. The other thing is that white pine, because of the resins in it, is flexible. And in the colonial era in New England, the white pine was mostly exported. It was used to build barns and homes and bridges and so forth. But much of the really big trees were exported to other countries for ships' masts. So a single mast for the top of the line warships um, that Nelson and the rest of them sailed on. those masts had to be 40 inches in diameter. And for the rule was in shipbuilding, for every inch in diameter, you needed a yard of length. So 40 inches in diameter and 40 yards, 120 feet tall. That's what you needed for a mast. And that was after the bark was taken off. And the
That's
bark could be
amazing.
a couple inches thick. So
Yeah.
in order to get a mast like that, and usually they were hewed down into an octagon because the octagon is actually a stronger shape than a circle. And so you needed a tree that was at least 45 inches in diameter for those kinds of ships.
Whew.
But the flexibility of the mast was important because in strong winds or when the ships were making a sharp turn to bring their guns to bear on their enemy, there was a lot of force exerted against those sails, and the sails alone weighed several tons altogether to keep the sails up. There was a lot of force exerted against the mast, and the mast had to be flexible to bend a little bit with that force and then to spring back to get that force to move the ship in the
Yep.
right way. So large size, um, clear. These big trees are clear of knots for the most part because it self prunes its lower branches. Um, Light and flexible wood and strong wood was the really desirable characteristic of white pine that no other tree really had. It had all of those characteristics.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, I you told a very interesting story in your book about you had already mentioned the warships, so maybe we're jumping ahead here a little bit because I wanted to also hear about um, when Europeans first came to the Americas. I'm just wondering what was going through their heads when they saw the white pine, and did they have anything similar like that in Europe? But
Hmm.
you had told the story of how uh, the King of England fell in love with the white pine and its role in these masts for their warships. And one of the untold, or one of the not well publicized realities of the revolution was Cornwallis's surrender
Right?
largely was determined because of the white pine. Can you tell that story?
Sure. Well, let me back up before we get to Cornwallis a little bit. The reason why the king wanted white pine was the British Navy was actually getting most of its pine for its ships from the Baltic states. And this kind of pine is what we call Scots pine. But if you go see that Scots pine tree in Scotland, it's a pretty ratty tree the way it grows there. The really nice trees were from the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and they were comparable to our white pine, but they were closer to get. The British Navy would just, sail up the Baltic and get the trees and bring them back. So they preferred those that species instead of white pine. And the colonists were making money by selling white pine to other countries that were farther away, like France and Spain and so forth, and not actually at first to Britain. Well, Britain and France and Spain were in one of their wars together, and the French and the Spanish Navy blockaded the Skagerrak, which is the entrance into the Baltic Sea. So the British could no longer get the pines from Estonia. And so the king said, or the admiral said to the king, well, we've got these white pines over in New England. We'll just take those. And the king said, fine, they're mine. I need them for my ships. So the king sent over a bunch of surveyors and told them that any tree bigger than 24 inches in diameter, you put an arrow on that tree with your hatchet. So it's three slashes that look like an arrow. And that tree is mine. It's not the colonist's tree anymore. Well, the colonists were making a lot of money off of these big trees. One of those trees for mass, they could sell for what in today's dollars is $16,000 for one tree.
Whew.
Wow.
Just they were making a lot of money off of this. And so the king, these are called the king's pine laws or the broad arrow laws. Um, the king this didn't sit too well with the colonists. And so they started in New England revolting against this. And they would tar and feather the surveyors when they came into town and so forth. Literally, literally. But this led in 1772 to a white pine riot in New Hampshire, where the surveyors were tarred and feathered and run out of town, and the colonists said, no more. These trees are ours, they're not yours. 3 years later is Bunker Hill. And the flag that the New England colonists raised over Bunker Hill had a white pine on it. It's called at that time the flag of New England. And so there was a blockade of British ships coming into Boston Harbor, or the harbors in Maine, where they would get the white pine. So the British no longer had access to white pine. They didn't have access to the Scots pine anymore. And they were sort of splicing little trees together to make a mast. And those masts were, as you can imagine, were not as strong or flexible or anything. They just were not good. And the masts were breaking. When the British entered, when we started the revolution, the British, these masts, even with the big white pines, had to be replaced every 3 to 5 years on the ship, just for wear and tear. They
Sure.
only had 170 of these masts in reserve in their yards because they thought, oh, this war is not going to last too long. How many times have you heard that about every war that's been started, right?
Yeah.
Well, this war is not going to last too long. We'll you know, kick these colonists in the teeth and we'll get our pines back. Well, they didn't. The war lasted. They ran out of the storehouse of white pine masts they had. They had to cobble together these crappier masts. And eventually these masts were breaking in the wind or in battle. They just couldn't do it. And the French Navy, by this time, towards the end of the war, was on our side. So we made a treaty with France, and Lafayette was coming over. And the French Navy was coming over towards the end of the war to assist us. And Washington, by this time, had the British Army under General Cornwallis sort of blockaded in Yorktown, the harbor of Yorktown in
Right.
Virginia. And so the king sent his fleet over to rescue Cornwallis to fight another day. But on the way, the British fleet ran into a big windstorm and all the masts of the ships were broken. In the meantime, the French, with better masts and maybe better navigation, sailed south of that storm, got to Yorktown, and so Cornwallis was pinched in between Washington's army on the land and the French Navy to sea. And Cornwallis said, "Well, that's the end of it. I surrender."
That's
And
amazing.
that,
Wow.
yeah, it was, yeah, uh, the role of white pine in the Revolution, and in particular in the American Maritimes, because afterwards, after the Revolution, now we had these pines and they were ours, and that was the reason why we could develop the fast clipper ships that would go to China for tea and around the world. Still, the record for going from Boston to China and back is still held by a clipper ship. There's no ship today that could do it as fast as the clipper ships with the white pine masts.
No
Wow.
kidding.
Huh.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the New England maritime industry, the clipper ships, the whalers, all of those ships had white pine masts.
Yeah, that is just amazing. And then I didn't know any of that history. Like the history that I've always heard with the white pine is then what would be building out, like you had mentioned, from St.
Right,
Louis, building all the homesteads, everything was built off
right.
of the white pine. And just a quick note back to, like you had mentioned, the weight. Uh, one of my favorite like old history photos. There's a sleigh with logs of white pine that probably goes up 25, 30 feet.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
like two horses are pulling that load of logs.
Well, yeah. And those photos were actually, those two horses never pulled that load of logs. I guarantee it. Um,
Yeah.
Those photos were often made um, as recruiting tools because they would take those photos to Scandinavia and say to the
Oh,
Swedish and Norwegian loggers, "Look at the pines you could cut if you came to America and worked for us."
wow.
And
Oh,
so they were staged.
so
They
they
would
were,
make
yeah,
these
they were
big
getting editing back then, even.
yeah, these
Wow.
big sleds of big logs and put a couple horses or oxen in front of it, and you think that, "Wow, look at that," but no, they never pulled that much. Those
Yeah.
logs were real, though. They when you see the size of those logs, that's what they were
Yeah.
cutting. It's pretty amazing, but a
That's
load
amazing.
like that was never pulled. Yeah.
Interesting. Very
Mhm.
interesting.
So, John, we now know that um, the white pine played a large role in construction and everything and anything. But then the white pine became a tree at risk. Is that fair to say?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, better than 80% of the original white pine was cut, even better than 95% in most cases. And about the middle of the 1800s, people started to realize that something was wrong here. So, what they were doing back then was not what we would consider today forestry or forest management or woodland management. They were cutting and cut and run was the term. So cut and keep going. There's plenty of pine here. We're never going to run out of it. And why bother replanting or anything else? But by the time you get to Wisconsin, western Wisconsin and Minnesota, the prairie is on the horizon there. And people start thinking, well, wait a second here, what's going on? But the other thing that was happening, particularly in New England and New York State, was once you cut all the white pine, the soil started eroding. And so the watersheds were really being drastically affected. Now, at the same time, they needed to cut the pine to have farms and pastures for sheep and cattle and so forth. But we didn't really realize at the time how to put all this stuff together and harvest and farm without harming the land. And so there was a guy in Vermont named George Perkins Marsh who started putting all this together and saying, what's happening here is the same thing that happened in Europe um, back in the Middle Ages. And they used to have big forests in Europe. They don't anymore. And we're heading that way if we don't do something about it. And so George Perkins Marsh and other people started um, advocating for a restoration of the forest, particularly of white pine, particularly in New England, or the preservation of what was left. And the Adirondack Park in upstate New York, the largest wilderness area east of the Mississippi, the second largest is here in northern Minnesota, the Boundary Waters. But the Adirondack Park was originally established to protect the upper part of the watershed of the Hudson River, which was the water supply and still is for New York City.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
New York City didn't want muddy water. They wanted a good supply, steady supply of fresh water. And in order to do that, the Adirondack forest had to be kept intact in order to do that. So the the lack of white pine or what happened to the landscape after the white pine was cut and taken off it and there was no forest left on the land made people start to think about the connection between the forest and the flow of water and particularly the water that they needed in the cities. So the ironic thing is they needed the white pine to build the cities, but they also needed the water to sustain the cities.
Yep.
And so little by little, people started thinking, well, we can't have one without the other in the North Woods here. We've got to have some of both, but we also want to harvest the pine too. We don't want to give that up necessarily. And so this was the start of forestry in America to figure out how to restore white pine to the forest, how to manage white pine so you could get a supply of timber, but still maintain an intact forest that would protect the watershed as well as protect wildlife habitat and everything else that we started to realize came from the woods, but was not infinite supply. So again,
Yeah.
white pine was the trigger to basically start thinking about conservation and scientific forestry in the United States.
Wow. Huh. Yeah, that's and is that kind of like then what the inspiration was for you to write this book? Or like how did that all come about with, picking the white pine as a topic for a book?
Yeah, well, I had written almost all of my research has been done in the North Woods on various things. And white pine to me is when I think of a forest, if you say the word forest to me, it's a white pine forest with maple understory, particularly in the fall, and the maples are all orange and red. So this is without a doubt my favorite tree. And I had written a previous book with the publisher of this book, Island Press, about essays about some about my research, but the different species that make up the North Woods altogether. And one of the species that I wanted to write about was white pine, but I realized that it was so important that it couldn't be just one essay or even a section of the book. It deserved a book by itself. So when I finished the previous book called "What Should a Clever Moose Eat," um, which has been a problem that I've studied in my own research, my editor said, "Well, what's your next book that you want to write?" And I said, "Well, white pine is sort of mentioned in this first book, but I think white pine needs a book by itself, and I love it." And everybody who goes up to one of these big white pine trees, they put their hand on the tree and they look up and they smile, and everybody loves white pine. So I think I should write a book about white pine. And it won't be about just the ecology of white pine or the natural history of white pine. I think it was so important in the development of so many things in this country that I want to try to interweave natural history and the history of this country, the cultural
Yeah.
history of the Northwoods, together in this book. And I remember my editor said, "How are you going to do that?" And I said, "I don't know. I need to think about this a little bit." And but I think that's the way to do it. And so we'll work it out. And we went through three or four different drafts of proposals and sample writing and everything else. And after about a year, she said, "Okay, I think we're on the right track now. Okay, here's your contract. Go to it." And then I spent 2 years sitting in this room with all of these books behind me, um, reading and thinking about white pine and going for walks in the woods through white pine forest just to get a sense of white pine and just that I could sort of hopefully in my writing I get into this book, what it's like to walk through these woods and think about the loggers and lumberjacks and conservation, the civilian conservation corps that my uncles were in, maybe some of your older relatives were in, and just
Sure.
everything about white pine and what it meant for those of us who live up here.
That's awesome. So,
Yeah.
everyone, I want to remind you that we are sitting here with Professor John Pastor. He is Professor Emeritus from the University of Minnesota Duluth and the author of White Pine, The Natural and Human History of a Foundational American Tree. And, John, I picked up right away in the writing of your book. You know, you start with you talk about Pangea and prehistoric, dinosaurs,
Yeah.
and this whole evolution to ancient Native Americans, and you trace the path that white pine played all the way through the formation of the United States to its near not extinction, but it got pretty thin there, and now it's starting to be, now that we've recognized um, the benefits of reforestation, white pine is coming back to a more strong footing.
Right.
But on your through your research, though, what is white pine a is it a tree that can live in like varied climates? Has it been taken to other parts of the world? Has it taken a hold anywhere else other than here in North America?
Well, the seedlings were taken back in the 1700s, early 1800s to England and Germany because they recognized the value of it, and particularly German foresters wanted to grow their own white pine. But it never really took off anywhere else. This is really the stronghold of
Hmm.
these kinds of pines. There is a closely related pine in northeast China and Korea called the Korean pine. And I've been there, and you walk you walk through a Korean pine forest, and there are maples and kind of something like a northern red oak in those forests. I tell you, it's hard put to tell for me to tell whether I'm in northeast China or I'm in Minnesota. They're very,
No
very
kidding.
similar
Wow.
forests,
Huh.
but it's not the same species. It's it's within that white pine branch of the pine family, but it's 5 needles and so forth.
Hmm.
But the white pine never really took off anywhere else.
Hmm.
Is there professional management of white pine here in North America with reforestation, where we've applied our scientific knowledge to its ideal conditions for it to grow back? Or do we just plant
Yeah.
seedlings and let them go?
Well, for a while we just planted seedlings and let them go. Um, One of the problems with that though was blister rust, and blister rust is this ties back to the white pines in Germany. After the white pine was logged off, and we started thinking, well, we've got to get white pine back. And really, what killed a lot of the white pine seedlings that were left were the fires that went through the logging debris, the logging slash.
Mm.
So there weren't any seedlings coming up anywhere very much. And we weren't thinking about nurseries back then, but the Germans foresters were had white pine in their nurseries all over the place, and they were getting ready to outplant them. So we went to Germany and bought seedlings and brought them back here. And all of those seedlings came into this country with blister rust on them. So that's how the blister rust was introduced into this country. And the first act quarantining importation of any species outside this country, which we're dealing a lot now with things like zebra mussels and so forth and so on, was the Plant Quarantine Act, which forbid the importation of white pine seedlings from Germany.
Oh,
So
wow.
then we
Huh.
had to, so the men in the CCC, a lot of their work, like my uncles always talked about it, was pulling up gooseberries, which were the alternate hosts that would spread the blister rust. But at the same time, we started our own nurseries here, gathering white pine seedlings and growing seedlings in nurseries for outplanting. But that's expensive. And if you're in the South and you could grow a big loblolly pine in 25, 30 years and then cut it down and sell it for yellow pine lumber, um, you could pay back the cost of seedlings. For um, the CCCs planted a lot of the seedlings, particularly of red pine, which is not susceptible to blister rust, all through here. But then those plantations had to be thinned and so forth. And it was planted before World War II. After World War II, men like my dad and uncles and stuff, they came back. They didn't want to go back and thin the woods. They wanted to build their own homes. And
Yeah.
so those CCC plantations are 100 years old now, but the growth of those trees has kind of stagnated because they need to
Yeah.
be thinned.
Yeah.
So what we've been thinking of lately is where we still have some white pine left, how do we manage the forest, knowing what we now know about the ecology of the forest and the role of fires in actually maintaining white pine, and how can we mimic fires through harvesting in the way that the fires kind of worked, but instead of burning up the timber, we take it off. And so there's a movement now, really um, sort of led by foresters both in Maine and also here in northern Minnesota, some working for the Forest Service and some private foresters. One that I've been working with a lot is a guy named John Ryla, who has the oldest continuous sawmill in operation in Minnesota. His and sawmill go back 5 generations,
Oh
and
wow.
he's got 25,000 acres in one chunk and other thousands acres in smaller chunks. This big chunk is called the Wolf Lake Tract, and his dad started thinking about restoring the white pine, and he's working a lot on restoring white pine in this forest. But also, he also manages for 23 other species that live with white pine, like sugar maple and northern red oak, yellow birch, basswood, and so forth, um, for his largely for his sawmill for high quality lumber. So I don't think any of his lumber go or any of his trees go for firewood, except maybe some of the scrappy stuff. So it
Right.
wouldn't help you guys if you were up here. But
Yeah.
he has beautiful lumber. You go into his warehouse, and it's like this huge library of gorgeous, gorgeous lumber that my dad, who was a carpenter, would just drool over, of pine, which are that's their flagship species, but also maple, both red and sugar maple, and northern red oak, and so forth and so on. So the idea that what John is doing and the Forest Service in the Chippewa National Forest, his land is located sort of adjacent to the Chippewa National Forest. So the foresters there and the Forest Service experiment station there are thinking about how to manage the white pine forest, not just for pure white pine, but for all the species together, of which white pine, like we started talking about, is the foundation species.
Yeah, that's the
Yep.
So,
foundational American tree. I love it.
Yep.
right.
Yeah.
So, how do you manage the forest to open it up so that the white pine seedlings get enough light so that they could grow, and also which will require taking out some of the maple and other species at the same time, but it costs money to harvest, and so that maple and everything else, there has to be a market for that.
Hmm.
And here, one of the really interesting things here is a lot of my friends are um, you know environmentalists and belong to environmental groups like the Sierra Club and so forth. And I'm sympathetic to a lot of what they're doing. As a professor who is a state employee, I never belonged to any of those advocacy groups because I just felt I was a public servant, and I shouldn't be. I should be using my science to help everybody, not advocating for one
Sure.
policy or another.
Yep.
I think that's
But
well said.
but they have a point. They have a point. But so the big thing now is we should manage for biodiversity, which is a what they're talking about is a combination of all species, not just one species, which I agree with. And actually, John Ryla, the sawmill owner, would agree with, and he'd say, "Well, that's what I'm doing." What the concept, the environmental groups don't always realize, and what I keep reminding my friends is that nobody is going to pay for managing for biodiversity. That's not a marketable thing.
Yeah.
If you're going to manage a forest, you got to pay. You got to pay for the logger salary, the trucks, everything else. You got management costs money. And when you manage a forest, the profit on those for those trees is going to be delayed, you
Yeah.
know,
Yep.
several decades until the trees get big enough.
Yep.
So
Sure.
you're running a risk of putting money in now and not recouping the profit until decades from now. So how are you going to manage for biodiversity and pay for it? The only way to do it is with sound forestry, like John Ryla and the Forest Service and the Chippewa National Forest and other foresters in New England and other sawmill owners are now trying to do. That's what pays for managing for biodiversity. So
Interesting.
sound forest management makes money, it gives people jobs, and it also maintains the diversity of species in the forest.
Yeah, interesting. That
Yeah,
was here in Ohio. We are known as the beech maple belt.
right.
And from my
Right.
understanding, the beech and the maple grew together in harmony. And
Hmm.
but what they did, they choked out the rest, the canopy, so nothing else was allowed to grow.
Right. Right.
It seems like around here, a lot of our pine trees were planted by the state. They used them along the highways for snow
Hmm.
fences. But now I'm starting to see a lot of them are all dying. What is
Yeah.
the what's killing these pine trees now? And I know out west they have like the beetle kill where
Right.
it does provide some beautiful lumber with that bluish hue that goes through it.
Yeah.
But what is the
Yeah.
big threat to our pines right now in the United States?
Well, I think the big threat, the blister rust is still a threat here. Although we have some blister rust resistant varieties, and also some trees naturally do survive blister rust, and those are the trees that are making the seeds for the next generation. Which is why John Ryla wants to preserve those trees because they've survived all of this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but I think uh, I'm not sure exactly what's going on down there. There is uh, the pine trees die from the top down. There's also a tip weevil that gets at the topmost leader shoot of the pine trees and can start killing it, working its way down. But a lot of what's happening may be, and I don't know this for sure, but since you're at the southern edge of the range of white pine, one of the things I would suspect is the warmer, hotter summers down there
Yeah,
that's coming about because of climate change. And I don't think climate change is going to cause the white pine to go extinct. But what it might do is make the range shift further northward and maybe further eastward out of western Minnesota to eastern Minnesota and western Wisconsin. So again, without seeing the trees, I can't say for sure, but I think we have to start suspecting the warmer summers and the warmer winters that we are having
sure.
for killing these trees.
So where did you grow up then, and where did you are you always been in the North Woods here?
Well, I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else. I've lived here about 40 or 50 years now, since I went to forestry school in Wisconsin. I grew up, though, in northern New Jersey, which is, again, the southern edge of the range of the North Woods. And
Ah, okay.
my introduction to white pine was the pines in the forest that I would walk through as a kid, but also my dad. My dad was a carpenter and cabinet maker, and he loved working with white pine.
Oh
And
wow.
so his shop was just, the smell of white pine, that great resinous smell. And even my dad, he smelled like white pine his whole life. Sitting in church, he would smell like white pine, you know. And so my dad, all of our house was built of white pine. It was paneled in white pine. The furniture in the house. My dad, um, the house was built on his family's farm. When he and his brothers came back from World War II, they didn't want a farm. They just split up the farm into different lots. My dad died in a white pine bed that he built in a house in a room paneled with white pine in a house built of white pine two by fours on land that he used to farm.
That's awesome.
Wow.
So that's
What a
Wow.
story.
quite, yeah. You don't hear
Yeah.
that too much of anybody anymore. So that
Yeah,
was
and
my
then
introduction to white pine, was white pine sawdust and furniture.
I'll bet when you get a whiff of pine, like at Lowe's or Home Depot, it probably takes you back. You're just that little boy
Oh
again,
yeah.
growing up.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
it's
Absolutely.
amazing.
Absolutely.
We talk about that in firewood about how just smelling wood,
Yep.
the smoke or something just takes you back. What a great
Yep.
memory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
my parents heated with wood, and my brother and I have great memories of cutting firewood and splitting it with my dad. And when my dad got up in age, one year my brother brought him a wood splitter, little one, and we started splitting that way. And then after a while, we thought it was a little too dangerous for my dad to be operating. So we would take a big log and put it down, and we'd say, "Dad, sit here and give us advice on splitting these logs." And we just had Dad sitting there and giving us advice on what to do.
all right.
It's a great memory.
That's great. Well, I know that John, you have an engagement that you must attend, and we didn't want to keep you here all day because I think we could.
I'd love it.
I'd still, yeah, I'd still like to. Maybe we can invite you back in a future date.
Sure.
Yeah, if you ever anything interesting comes about, or you write another book, or involved in another paper, give us a call.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But, John, we can't just let you go.
No, we cannot, because we have a tradition here when we have a guest on the Woodhounds podcast that we need to woodhound them with some random questions that just the first thing that comes to your mind you answer with. So
Okay.
you're not going to be prepared for some of these, but whatever comes to into your mind first, you just rattle off the answer. Rapid fire.
Okay.
That's
All
right.
right.
And you have to, and if you don't beat the clock, then you will face a serious woodhound penalty.
Oh, oh no.
Whatever that is, we don't know yet, but whatever.
so, so are you ready?
All right. Dan, are you going to
I'm
start
ready.
the clock? Dan,
I've
you
got
start the clock and ask the first question.
I've got the clock going, and here we go. What car did you take your driver's test in?
A International Harvester Scout.
What is your favorite chainsaw?
Husqvarna.
Oh, what is your favorite fast food restaurant?
I don't eat fast food.
Okay, we
Sorry.
got to throw him off the show, Dan. Come on. We got rules on this show here. Okay, where is your dream vacation?
Northern Minnesota, where I live now.
Love it.
Nice. Do you believe in UFOs?
No.
What is your favorite rock band?
I don't usually listen to rock music, but I would have to say the band.
Yeah.
That's going way
Love it.
back, but the band.
This
All right.
next one I think we know the answer to already, but what is your favorite firewood species?
Oak. Northern red oak.
Yes.
Okay, would you rather go to a truck pull or a symphony orchestra?
Oh, sorry guys, symphony orchestra.
Who is your favorite historical figure?
Ooh, that's hard. I'll say this might sound corny, but I'll say Gifford Pinchot, the forester who founded the U.S. Forest Service. He was an
Nice.
amazing
Excellent.
guy.
I thought I was going to hear Thoreau. Okay,
I find Thoreau a little hard to read sometimes.
I concur. Okay, last question. What is your favorite sports team?
Minnesota Twins.
Oh my. All right. There you go. You have now
I think
officially been woodhounded on the Woodhounds
John-
podcast.
John got through that pretty good.
Yeah.
He
Thank
got
you,
through that a
guys.
little bit
Thank
more
you.
efficiently than others, for sure. Yeah. All right. Well, John, I hate to say that we have to say goodbye, but we have to say goodbye. But I just had a blast meeting you, getting to know you, and I really enjoyed reading your book. White
Well, thank you
Pine,
very
the
much.
natural and human history of a foundational American tree. Mr. John Pastor.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
John.
very
It was
much. It was fun.
great talking to you. Great hearing about the pine and all the history behind it, and really enjoyed sitting here and chatting. So you come
Thank
back
you.
on sometime.
I enjoyed it a lot too.
So I want to thank Professor John Pastor for sitting with us today, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening to the Woodhounds podcast.
The #1 firewood podcast in the world.
In the world. And I want to tell everyone to stay
safe
and be
cool.
And John, have
a great day.